So in our typecasting section, we're going to look at our final line, which is the floats plus the string in the typecast. And we scroll down the page to take a look, and we've got a float plus string section here. So let's just set our floating point number equal to 100.55. And remember that an integer is just the 100 part, but if you put a dot in it, then we get a floating point number. So 100.55 is the floating point number. And then we'll create a string, so we'll just call that S for string and make the string hello world. And then we'll try to join a floating point number to a string in the same way that we try to join an integer to a string, and let's see what happens. So we'll create a variable called result, and we'll assign that variable the summation of the float plus the string, and then we will try to print out the result. And we will also try to print out the type of the result, just like this. And we will actually go and run the code and just have a look at it and see what happens. And we get a type error, unsupported operand types for float and string. So we can't add a floating string just naturally, which is kind of like what we saw when we tried to do it with an integer. Now again, just as a reminder, if we did have and we can do a typecasting, or we can attempt to typecast either the string to a floating point number, or we can try to typecast the string, the float to a string, or we could possibly try to typecast the string to an integer, which is compatible with a floating point number. So let's just try and typecast the string to a floating point number. We'll just start with that, and we can use a float function in Python. That's the built-in function, and we can see here that it converts a string or number to a floating point number if possible. So we'll attempt to run this, and we get the same value error as we had when we tried to typecast a string to an integer. Could not convert string to float, hello world. But we do note that if we did have something that looked like this, which was 99.99 for example, which would classify as a float, that this would be acceptable, because if possible, this is now a series of digits as opposed to a series of characters, and that could be typecasted. We would also be able to typecast this 99 because it would convert it to a integer, but which would then be typecasted to a float. So we could try and run that, and that's perfectly fine as well, and we get back the result of class float. So this is perfectly possible. But when it comes to actually working with strings, this is not allowed, and we could prove that it's not allowed in a try except block as well. The other thing that we can do is we can try to typecast the float to a string. So we will do str for string on the floating point number, and if we hover over the built-in method description, we can see that it says create a new string object from the given object. And when we try to run this, what we get is 100.55 and then hello world, and it's of class string, and that's because this type is converted to a string and this type is converted to a string. Now let's just, for the sake of it, make this a bit more attractive in terms of our description, and we can do something like this: I am, and then and let's just assume that this floating point number is our height, so 150.50, and then we could do something like S1 and S2, and then centimeters. In fact, let's just even remove the strings like this and just put them directly into the print statement. So rather than doing the type conversion here, we will attempt to do this, which is I am, and we have to remember to put the space in, and then plus, so we're going to do a concatenation, and we'll try to put the float in here. This would potentially fail because we know that we can't concatenate a float, which means can't join a float, add a float to a string, and then put centimeters tall. Now, assuming that we're 150.5 centimeters tall, what would come out of here? We would expect to see that this would run, but of course it's not going to run because this has not yet been converted, but we can try and execute the run. And we get the same type error, cannot concatenate string to a float, but what we can do is convert the float, or cannot concatenate a float to a string. We can convert the float to a string like this, and this would be viable in Python and it would work, and we don't need the result anymore, but the result of this entire string is actually a string. So we have concatenated a float into a string in a nice way.